Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. This is our third and final video summarizing Jekyll and Hyde. This video will summarize chapters 9 and 10. Let's begin. Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. This chapter contains the contents of a letter that Lanyon gave Utterson before he died. Before we dive into this chapter, let's revise what we know so far about this letter. In chapter 6, Utterson found Lanyon looking very ill. He was about to die. Lanyon says that he has suffered a great shock, but won't reveal more. Lanyon has clearly seen something truly terrifying that has ruined his health. But what could this be? Well, we know that this great shock has something to do with Dr. Jekyll. When Utterson mentions their friend Jekyll, Lanyon's face changes. He says that he never wishes to see or talk about Dr. Jekyll ever again. Now, before Lanyon dies, he sends Utterson a letter. Lanyon writes that Utterson should not open this letter until after Jekyll's death or disappearance. This letter will describe the great shock suffered by Lanyon. Utterson obeys Lanyon's instructions and leaves this letter unopened. We now need to zoom into chapter 8. You may remember that this chapter ends with Utterson and Poole breaking into Jekyll's cabinet and finding a number of different documents. One of these documents is a note from Jekyll. Jekyll writes that he has disappeared and tells Utterson to read Dr. Lanyon's letter. Utterson reads Lanyon's letter in chapter 9. Lanyon's letter is going to describe the great shock that ruined his life. Lanyon begins his letter by describing events that happened just after Jekyll's dinner party. You may remember this dinner party from chapter 6. Well, in chapter 9, Lanyon writes that he received a strange letter from Jekyll after the dinner party. This letter made a very strange request. It asked Lanyon to break into Dr. Jekyll's cabinet and bring a drawer of chemicals back to his own house. It offered no explanation why Lanyon should do this. Confused, but wanting to help Jekyll, Lanyon did as he was asked. With the help of a locksmith and Poole, Lanyon broke into Jekyll's cabinet and took the drawer of chemicals. Lanyon also followed the next set of instructions in the letter. He went home with the drawer of chemicals and waited until midnight for them to be collected. Who could possibly arrive at this late hour of the night to collect this drawer? And what could they possibly want with Jekyll's chemicals? At midnight, a small, ugly man arrived at Lanyon's door. He was wearing clothes that were far too big for him. This was Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde was very excited about seeing a drawer of chemicals. He was prancing around, grating his teeth, and acting like a lunatic. Upon being given the drawer, Hyde mixed several chemicals together to create a strange-looking liquid. He then asked Lanyon whether the scientist would like to watch Hyde drink this potion. Lanyon agreed. He had already gone to so much trouble for Dr. Jekyll and was very curious to watch what might happen if Hyde drank this potion. Something terrifying next happened. Hyde drank the potion and his features melted and altered until he transformed into Dr. Jekyll. Lanyon screamed for dear life as he watched this horrific transformation take place. Lanyon finishes his letter by writing that the things Jekyll told him next were too shocking to write down. Jekyll probably told Lanyon about his creation of Mr. Hyde, but we won't find out about Jekyll's story until chapter 10. This traumatic event has ruined Lanyon's health. Lanyon finishes his letter by writing that he expects to die soon. Okay, let's now revise the key things that happen in Chapter 9, Dr. Lanyon's narrative. Lanyon writes that he received a strange letter from Jekyll after the dinner party. The letter asked Lanyon to break into Dr. Jekyll's cabinet and bring a drawer of chemicals back to his house. Lanyon followed these instructions. At midnight, Mr. Hyde arrived to collect the chemicals. Hyde mixed the chemicals together to make a potion. With Lanyon's permission, he then drank this potion and transformed into Dr. Jekyll. Lanyon finishes his letter by writing that what Jekyll told him next was too shocking to write down. This traumatic event has ruined Lanyon's health. The letter ends by saying that he expects to die soon. Okay, let's now test your memory. You have 1 minute to go through these sentences and fill in the key words. Off you go. Okay, let's see how well we have done. Chapter 9, Dr. Lanyon's narrative. Lanyon writes that he received a strange letter from Jekyll after the dinner party. The letter asked Lanyon to break into Dr. Jekyll's cabinet and bring a drawer of chemicals back to his house. Lanyon followed these instructions. At midnight, Mr. Hyde arrived to collect the chemicals. Hyde mixed the chemicals together to make a potion. With Lanyon's permission, he then drank this potion and transformed into Dr. Jekyll. Lanyon finishes his letter by writing that what Jekyll told him next was too shocking to write down. This traumatic event has ruined Lanyon's health. The letter ends by saying that he expects to die soon. Okay, well done if you got full marks there. Let's now go on to Chapter 10. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Now, you may remember what happens at the end of Chapter 8. Utterson and Poole break into Jekyll's cabinet, but there is no sign of Jekyll. They do, however, find 4 things. They find Hyde's dead body. They find Jekyll's will, which has now been changed. Utterson, rather than Hyde, is now the beneficiary of this will. They find Jekyll's note saying that he has disappeared and telling Utterson to read Dr. Lanyon's letter. As we know, Utterson reads Lanyon's letter in Chapter 9. And fourthly, they find a large document, Dr. Jekyll's confession. Well, this document is Chapter 10. It is basically Jekyll's account of his life. It unravels all of the mysteries of the novel for us. How did Jekyll create Hyde? Why did Jekyll create Hyde? How did Jekyll disappear? How did Hyde die? All of these mysteries will be explained in Chapter 10. Before we move on, let me just explain how the timings of this story match up with the chapters of the novel. This issue of timings is probably the greatest source of confusion that pupils face when they study this text. It's also essential that you understand this if you're going to go and understand Chapter 10. So, listen carefully. Chapters 1 to 8 follow a chronological order. So Chapter 1 describes events that happen earlier in the story, and Chapter 8 describes events that happen later in the story. Chapter 1 describes Hyde trampling the young girl. Chapter 4 describes Carewe's murder. In Chapter 6, Lanyon dies after his great shock. And in Chapter 8, Hyde's dead body is found. So chapters 1 to 8 describe events in the order in which they take place. Chapters 1 to 8 follow a chronological order. But Chapter 9 breaks this pattern. Chapter 9, a letter written by Lanyon before he dies, describes the events that happened in Chapter 6 once again, but this time from Lanyon's perspective. So while Chapter 6 describes Lanyon's death from Utterson's perspective after his great shock, Chapter 9 describes Lanyon's great shock from Lanyon's perspective, in which he describes how he watched Hyde transform into Jekyll. So chapters 1 to 8 follow a chronological order of events, but this pattern breaks when we get to Chapter 9. Chapter 10 also does not follow the chronological order of the story. Chapter 10 begins by describing events that took place long before Chapter 1. This final chapter begins long before Hyde tramples the young girl. In fact, this final chapter begins long before Hyde was even created. Chapter 10 begins by describing Jekyll's youth. It then describes how Jekyll created Hyde. And after this, Chapter 10 begins to narrate the same events that were described in chapters 1 to 8. So Chapter 10 describes how Hyde trampled the young girl, again. Chapter 10 describes Carewe's murder, again. Chapter 10 describes how Lanyon dies after his great shock, again. In Chapter 10, Hyde/Jekyll prepare to die, while in Chapter 8, as we said before, Hyde's dead body is found. So Chapter 10 narrates the same events that take place in chapters 1 to 8, but this time it narrates these events from Dr. Jekyll's perspective. Now let's study what happens in Chapter 10. The key thing to understand about this chapter is it is written from Jekyll's perspective. It's very much Henry Jekyll's account of his life. And this chapter very much unravels all the mysteries of this story so far. Up until this point, Jekyll has appeared to be a rather mysterious figure in the reader's mind. But since this chapter is written from Jekyll's perspective, we finally understand the arc of this character. Jekyll will now reveal all. So, Chapter 10 begins, and Dr. Jekyll tells us that he was born into a respectable, upper-class family. Handsome, rich, and hard-working, the young Dr. Jekyll appeared to be a respectable gentleman. But appearances can be deceiving. Jekyll held some dark secrets. As a young man, Jekyll enjoyed some indecent activities in secret. Now, he never reveals to his reader what these were. He simply calls them his concealed pleasures. By the time he had grown up, Jekyll found himself living a double life. He possessed a reputation as a respectable man of science in public, but enjoyed immoral pleasures in private. Jekyll's warring desires were a source of great angst. On one hand, he wanted to do good and use his scientific talents to improve the world. On the other hand, he desired to enjoy all sorts of immoral pleasures. It was as if two different people lived within Jekyll at the same time. One moral, benevolent, and respectable. The other immoral, twisted, and uncivilized. It was from this experience of living a double life that Jekyll formed his philosophy about human nature. Jekyll believed that his experience was not exceptional. In his view, everyone experiences the same warring, contradictory desires, the same inner conflict between their good and evil sides. Jekyll thus formed his philosophy about human nature. His ideas can very much be summed up in his words, "Man is not truly one, but truly two." These words reflect Jekyll's belief in the dual nature of humanity. In other words, Jekyll believes that everyone has a dual nature. What does it mean to have a dual nature? Well, if you have a dual nature, you have two sides to your character. Jekyll seems to think that everyone has a good side and an evil side. Maybe the easiest way to think about Jekyll's idea is to consider Homer Simpson. Sometimes when Homer is tempted to do something wrong, like eat too many donuts for example, he experiences an inner conflict. This is often represented by an argument between an angel Homer and a demon Homer that takes place within his head. The demon Homer wants him to eat the donut, the angel Homer tells him not to. Now, the interesting idea here is that both the angel and demon are Homer. They are both different sides of his character. The angel represents his good side, and the demon represents the evil side of his character. Well, this is very much a reflection of Jekyll's idea of duality. Homer has a dual nature, and Jekyll believes that everyone has a dual nature. Everyone has a good side to their character and an evil side to their character. But Jekyll was unhappy with living life with this dual nature. His evil side constantly felt repressed and unsatisfied. His good side always felt guilty for the immoral things he was doing. Jekyll felt divided between the two sides of his character. On one hand, he was good. On the other hand, he was evil. There was a constant inner conflict between the two sides of Jekyll's nature. Jekyll thus directed his scientific research towards an attempt to separate his good and evil natures. Perhaps he could house each side of his nature in two separate identities. His evil nature would have its own body, and his good nature a different body. Jekyll's fascination with altering human nature in this way caused him to fall out with Lanyon. Lanyon disapproved of Jekyll's experiments, describing them as scientific heresies. Lanyon very much believed that Jekyll was attempting to play God by tampering with human nature. But Jekyll continued with his research, and eventually created a potion to separate his two natures. Jekyll thus drank the potion and transformed into Mr. Hyde. Upon seeing himself in the mirror, the scientist felt a leap of welcome. He recognized himself. He recognized his evil nature. Now we must remember that Jekyll had originally been planning to separate his two sides altogether. He would house each side of his character in separate bodies. But this potion didn't quite work. Instead of separating Jekyll's two natures, this potion got rid of Jekyll's good nature altogether. It left only Jekyll's evil nature, Mr. Hyde. But Jekyll came to love becoming Hyde. As Hyde, Jekyll could enjoy all sorts of immoral adventures without suffering any guilt or threatening his reputation. What were these adventures? Well, Jekyll never really reveals much about them. All we know is Hyde enjoyed doing many depraved and evil things. For example, he trampled the young girl in the street. You may remember this from chapter 1. All was going well. Jekyll paid for Hyde to live in the flat in Soho, and wrote Hyde into his will, much to the concern of Utterson. Jekyll could thus pursue his immoral desires while retaining his reputation as a respectable gentleman. Now, we must understand that up until this point, Jekyll had chosen when he would transform into Hyde. He drank a potion every time he wished to transform. Jekyll was in control of this process. But one night everything changed. Without drinking any of the potion, Jekyll went to sleep in his own body. But he woke up as Mr. Hyde. This was very scary. Jekyll had involuntarily transformed into his alter ego. Was Jekyll's evil nature, Mr. Hyde, beginning to gain dominance over his body? Worried by this idea, Jekyll stopped taking the potion altogether. But 2 months later, Jekyll could resist the temptation of becoming Hyde no longer. He drank the potion once again. This led to disastrous consequences. Repressed for so long, Hyde emerged, savage and violent. Hyde found Sir Danvers Carew in a street, and brutally beat the old man to death. You may remember this from chapter 4. Jekyll felt full of guilt and shame for this horrendous crime. He prayed to God for forgiveness. You may remember that Utterson visited Jekyll in chapter 5 and found him looking deadly sick. Well, from chapter 10, we now know that Jekyll's health had clearly deteriorated over his torment and guilt for Carew's murder. After this, Jekyll decided never to transform into Hyde ever again. For 2 months, Hyde disappeared from Jekyll's life. Without Hyde's influence, Jekyll's health and happiness returned. He became sociable again. He even held a dinner party with his friends Lanyon and Utterson. You may remember this dinner party from chapter 6. But one day Jekyll fell to temptation yet again. He wasn't tempted to become Mr. Hyde, but rather to enjoy some of the concealed pleasures of his youth. But this dip into darkness gave Hyde a foothold in Jekyll's life. The next day, Jekyll was sitting in a park when he suddenly noticed that his hands had turned hairy. He had once again involuntarily transformed into Hyde. Now, it was very dangerous to be in Hyde's form. Since Carew's murder, the police had been searching all through London for Hyde. Jekyll desperately needed his potion, but couldn't return to his house as Hyde. This would risk arrest. It was now that Jekyll sent the letter, asking for Lanyon's help. Lanyon broke into Jekyll's cabinet and brought his chemicals back to his own house. Hyde later arrived at Lanyon's house to collect them. You may remember this from chapter 9. We all know what happens next. Hyde arrives at Lanyon's house. Hyde drinks the potion and transforms into Dr. Jekyll. And Lanyon dies, having experienced this great shock. After this, Jekyll had to take a double dose of potion every 6 hours to avoid a spontaneous transformation into Hyde. Jekyll was so worried about these spontaneous transformations that he locked himself in his cabinet. But Jekyll still found it very difficult to protect his secret. One of these spontaneous transformations took place, for example, when he was talking to Lanyon and Utterson from his window. You may remember this from chapter 7. And then disaster strikes. The salt necessary for Jekyll's potion runs out. Jekyll orders more, but discovers that this salt no longer has the same effect. Jekyll now realizes that the original salt in his first batch of potion must have contained an impurity that made the potion work. Jekyll is about to transform permanently into Mr. Hyde. He only has a few minutes left. Knowing that he only has a few more minutes in his own body, Jekyll spends his final moments doing 3 things. He firstly changes his will to make Utterson the beneficiary rather than Hyde. He secondly writes Utterson a note telling him to read Lanyon's letter, as we know Utterson reads this in chapter 9. And thirdly, he writes this confession for Utterson that we study in chapter 10. Towards the end of his confession, Jekyll wonders what Hyde will do next. He has a difficult decision to make. Will he A. surrender to the police and be hanged for Carew's murder, or B. kill himself? We know from the end of chapter 8 the decision that Hyde makes. Hyde decides to drink some poison and kill himself, rather than face Utterson and Poole and be arrested by the police. And that brings us to the end of chapter 10. Okay, let's now revise the key ideas of chapter 10, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Handsome, rich, and hard-working, the young Dr. Jekyll appeared to be a respectable gentleman. By the time he had grown up, Jekyll found himself living a double life. He possessed a reputation as a respectable man of science in public, but enjoyed immoral concealed pleasures in private. Jekyll formed his philosophy about the duality of human nature. Man is not truly one, but truly two. Jekyll directed his scientific research towards an attempt to separate his good and evil natures. Jekyll's potion got rid of his good nature altogether. It left only his evil nature, Mr. Hyde. As Hyde, Jekyll could enjoy all sorts of immoral adventures without suffering any guilt or ruining his reputation as a respectable gentleman. One day Jekyll woke up as Hyde. He had involuntarily transformed into his alter ego. Jekyll therefore decided to stop taking the potion altogether, but 2 months later Jekyll drank the potion again. Emerging savage and violent, Mr. Hyde then murdered Sir Danvers Carew. Filled with guilt, Jekyll decided to never take the potion again. For 2 months Hyde disappeared from Jekyll's life. Jekyll became sociable again and held a dinner party for his friends, Lanyon and Utterson. Jekyll began to enjoy some of the concealed pleasures of his youth once again. When Jekyll was in a park, he then involuntarily transformed into Mr. Hyde. Jekyll sent a letter to Lanyon to arrange for Hyde to collect the potion. Jekyll then had to take a double dose of potion every 6 hours to avoid a spontaneous transformation into Hyde. The salt necessary for Jekyll's potion next ran out. Jekyll ordered more, but discovered that this salt no longer had the same effect. The original salt in his first batch of potions must have contained an impurity that made the potion work. Jekyll is about to transform permanently into Mr. Hyde. Jekyll spends his final moments changing his will to make Utterson the beneficiary rather than Hyde, writing Utterson a note telling him to read Lanyon's letter. Utterson reads this in chapter 9, and writing his confession for Utterson. Jekyll wonders whether Hyde would rather surrender to the police and be hanged or kill himself. From chapter 8 we know that Hyde kills himself. Right, it's now time to test your memory. You now have 1 minute to go through each of these sentences and fill in the key words in bold. Initials have been provided to help you. Off you go. And now on to our next set of sentences. We're now halfway there. On to our next set of sentences. And on to our final slide. Okay, let's see the right answers. Let's see how well we have done. Chapter 10, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Handsome, rich and hard-working, the young Dr. Jekyll appeared to be a respectable gentleman. By the time he had grown up, Jekyll found himself living a double life. He possessed a reputation as a respectable man of science in public, but enjoyed immoral concealed pleasures in private. Jekyll formed his philosophy about the duality of human nature. Man is not truly one, but truly two. Jekyll directed his scientific research towards an attempt to separate his good and evil natures. Jekyll's potion got rid of his good nature altogether. It left only his evil nature, Mr. Hyde. As Hyde, Jekyll could enjoy all sorts of immoral adventures without suffering any guilt or ruining his reputation as a respectable gentleman. One day Jekyll woke up as Hyde. He had involuntarily transformed into his alter ego. Jekyll therefore decided to stop taking the potion altogether, but 2 months later Jekyll drank the potion again. Emerging savage and violent, Mr. Hyde then murdered Sir Danvers Carew. Filled with guilt, Jekyll decided to never take the potion again. For 2 months Hyde disappeared from Jekyll's life. Jekyll became sociable again and held a dinner party for his friends, Lanyon and Utterson. Jekyll began to enjoy some of the concealed pleasures of his youth once again. When Jekyll was in a park, He then involuntarily transformed into Mr. Hyde. Jekyll sent a letter to Lanyon to arrange for Hyde to collect the potion. Jekyll then had to take a double dose of potion every 6 hours to avoid a spontaneous transformation into Hyde. The salt necessary for Jekyll's potion next ran out. Jekyll ordered more, but discovered that this salt no longer had the same effect. The original salt in his first batch of potions must have contained an impurity that made the potion work. Jekyll is about to transform permanently into Mr. Hyde. Jekyll spends his final moments changing his will to make Utterson a beneficiary rather than Hyde, writing Utterson a note telling him to read Lanyon's letter. Utterson reads this in chapter 9. Writing his confession for Utterson. Jekyll wonders whether Hyde would rather surrender to the police and be hanged or kill himself. From chapter 8, we know that Hyde kills himself. Well done if you got full marks there. And that finishes our summary of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will be releasing much more content over the coming weeks and months. But until that time, all the best.